Hi, it's Rory from counsellingtutor.com, and this presentation is one requested by those who are following me on the Counselling Tutor Facebook page, and it's a presentation on the skilled helper model by Gerard Egan. It's going to be a long video, you might want to take a few notes, but I think I've covered it all and it's very comprehensive. So without further ado, let's go to the PowerPoint. So here we are at the PowerPoint. And here's Gerard Egan and the book that he wrote in the 1970s called The Skilled Helper. And I'm delighted to say Gerard Egan's still with us, he's still alive. Unlike a lot of the theorists on the channel I discuss, he's still with us. I think he must be in his late 80s now, but with us he still is. And just a word about the book, I'll put a link in the description below, so you can link to the book if you want to buy it. However, the covers do change from time to time. So Gerard Egan is a psychologist and a Emeritus Professor, so an academic man, and he's written this book, which is a world best-selling book. It's used by the theory, and the model is used by people who help others the world over. So we're going to have a look at the two main components of the skilled helper, and the two main components are really theory and the application of theory through the use of counselling skills. So we're going to go to the theory first, and to do this I'm going to show you a graphic. Might be useful to show you a graphic for those of you watching who may be visual learners. A graphic may be useful for you. So the theory in a graphic form is, first of all, exploration. So initially when a client meets a helper or a counsellor, the first part of the meeting will be exploration. They'll be exploring the difficulties that the client has. The second is challenging, and here is where it separates, the Egan model separates itself from person-centred. So for those of you who are writing assignments, compare and contrast, this might be very useful for you. So we don't challenge in classic person-centred therapy. So there's a big difference. This model would challenge. An example of challenge may be a client who said, well, I never get out. I'm always in the house. I never see anybody. And then a few seconds later, they say, when I was down the shops talking to my friend, and then when I went to see my daughter, and the challenge would be, I hear that you say you never get out, you never see anybody, but I've noticed that you've just said that you saw your daughter and you were at the shops the other day. So you can challenge, and sometimes people get into a mindset of what they believe to be true is correct, but once they're challenged, it helps them see other opportunities and other possibilities. So challenging. And the third, which is completely different to person-centered therapy and lends itself more to our friends in the solution focus world, or even our friends in CBT, is action planning, setting some goals and targets for something to happen, for the client to change. And it's important in this that it's the client who sets the targets, not the counsellor or the helper. And it could be something like, I think I'd like to get out a little more. I might go to the shops twice a week instead of once a week, as a very simple example. So that would be an action plan, and the helper would write that down, make a note of it. It would be agreed. And then in the next session, there'd be a review. So the helper would start the review. And once they checked that the client was okay and welcomed them into the room, they may say, okay, last week you talked about going down to the shops. How did that work out for you? And that's how the model works: exploration, challenge, action planning, and review. So it's a very structured model. And as I say, it's used by helping professionals the world over: doctors, dentists, teachers, teaching assistants, counsellors. Anybody really is in the world of helping others probably uses the model without even thinking, because it's such a well-known model, and others teach it to you. You see other people doing it, and you pick it up. But that's the model. So I'm going to just overview the theory. so that those of you writing assignments maybe would get benefit from that. So Egan's skilled helper model is what's called an eclectically based solution focus model, and it's based on Karkoff's theory of high-level functioning helpers. So eclectic means it's drawn from a lot of different ideas in psychology, and Egan got a lot of different ideas, and then what he did was he made his own model from it. So that's eclectic. And we're going to talk a little bit about high-functioning helpers, what they are. A high-functioning helper needs to be able to show congruence, that's being genuine and real. Immediacy, that means that they're not afraid of showing a little bit of themselves and their emotions around what a client speaks about, as long as it's respectful and it doesn't take the whole of the session up, But say, for instance, a client said, I've been in a car crash. I might say, that sounds really scary. How was it for you? That's immediacy. Empathy, respect, concreteness, and a non-judgmental attitude. And concreteness is best described as emotional robustness, in that if you're emotionally robust, you may hear stories that are very, very difficult to hear. And as a helper, you've got to be emotionally strong enough to be able to listen to the material without being diminished yourself or burst into tears, So that's what concreteness means, emotionally robust. And as I said before, the model could be used by any professional helper, as long as they have the skill set to be able to build an effective relationship. And I'm going to come to that in the next part of the presentation. So as we keep going through the theory, helpers need to be able to share relevant self-disclosure and confront any discrepancies in the client's story. So we talked about challenge earlier on. But also relevant self-disclosure. Now, what is relevant self-disclosure? Well, I'll give you another example. If I had a client in this model who said to me, I'm unemployed and it's really, really difficult at the moment financially and I'm feeling a bit down about it, I would be able to say, well, actually, I've been unemployed in the past and I know how difficult it can be. Tell me what your difficulties are. So in that, I've shared a little bit about myself, but I've also acknowledged that maybe my experience of being unemployed and their experience are totally different things. And helpers also need to have a good understanding of the SOLER model and be able to practice it. And I'm going to tell you what the SOLER model is and how it's applied in the next part of the presentation. And Egan's theories are built around the theory of social influence, and I'm going to tell you what social influence is. Some of you may know, but I'll share it with you. Social influence, and I've got a quote here, is behaviour that one person causes in another, intentionally or unintentionally, as a result of the way the changed person perceives themselves in the relationship to the influencer, other people and society in general. Bit of a wordy quote, that, really, but it effectively means, I'm okay, you're okay. If the client can see that the person who is the helper is all right, is okay, then what will happen is that there's a tendency for them to try and access their own coping mechanisms. And a good example of that is our friends in the recovery world. They talk about visible recovery, and visible recovery is where someone who's had a difficulty with drugs and alcohol in the past becomes a helper, working with people who are still in active addiction, and it gives hope, because what happens is the person in visible recovery is saying by who they are, not just what they say, that look, I was in that situation, but hey, I'm in recovery now. If I can do it, the idea is that you can too. So that is what social influence is. If you associate with people who are okay, then you're more likely to find your own okayness, if that's a word at all. But that's the basis of social influence. It is a big theory. I've really just kind of paraphrased it a little bit. So I'm just going to go into those phases that we've talked about earlier on. So stage 1's the exploration phase, and that's being attentive, using positive body language, using affirming gestures such as nodding and affirming verbals. And affirming verbals are some things like aha, that type of thing. where you're clearly listening and clearly acknowledging the client's story. Active listening, leaning forward if appropriate, so you're really interested in what the client's saying and they can see that. Using silence to help the clients explore their story, not interrupting, but giving that space and allowing clients to tell their story. And also being very thoughtful about your responses. In this stage, the exploration phase, it's very important that you're thoughtful of your responses. A poorly thought out response here could close the client down. And then finally in this phase, you're exploring the client's frame of reference, what they believe to be their truths. And that comes up a lot in counselling and psychotherapy. Frame of reference, that idea of a person's own subjective reality. Also in the exploration phase, you're offering acceptance and empathy. You're trying to see the story from the client's perspective. Being non-judgmental is really important here. The client will tell you a lot more if they do not feel judged or criticised. So that's a non-judgmental attitude. And paraphrasing and summarising, always checking your understanding with the client. So a paraphrase is just feeding back or reflecting back in their words, in your words, what they've said. And a summary is just a longer paraphrase, really. It's kind of what you say when you come to the end of a session, where you're kind of summarising what's happened and what the client said. Also in the exploration phase, focusing, that's a really important skill. Which of the issues seem most important to the client? And you'll find that people come to counselling with lots of different issues, and the skill of focusing is very useful to find out which issue is the most pressing, which one do they want to look at and work on first. And sometimes what will happen is when they work on the one presenting issue, the other issues tend to get sorted out by default. They're all connected to the bigger issue. Reflecting feelings, so using words like, you sound hurt by that, that sounds difficult. It sounds like you might be frightened. Asking the client the feelings, and help cover blind spots and gaps in their perception and assessment of their situation. So maybe if it was someone who's working in a school, a young person may come and say, I've failed this test and I'm going to fail my exams, and I'm not going to get anywhere in life, and it might be a catastrophe. So the use of helping uncover blind spots is about, and looking at perceptions is really about saying, okay, is this really the truth? It's a little bit of a challenge, and saying, okay, so what else could you do to help you get those grades? Let's have a look at what happened. So it's about thinking about gaps in people's perceptions. I'll never pass my exam, but you passed the last one is a gap in perception. In this phase, questioning is useful. So is there anything that you've missed? You could say to a client, is there anything you missed? Is there anything maybe that you've not thought of? And that opens up a discussion. And is there any other way of looking at it? Sometimes by getting someone to look at something in a slightly different way, it may be that the problem they have actually becomes less of a problem. Questioning, again, useful questions can be, how did you feel about that? What were you thinking? And that has to be delivered in a non-judgmental way. What were you thinking? So what were you thinking when that happened? What was that like? And what else is there about that? So you're trying to get information. It's a really exploration phase, and you're trying to explore and helping the client explore all the options. Now, stage 2 is challenging, and one really good technique is asking someone what might this look like from another person's point of view. And one of the techniques to do that is to say, if you had a friend going through the same problem, what would you tell your friend? And it's amazing that people can tell their friends with absolute clarity what they would do if they're in the same situation, but the client can't tell themselves that. So that reframing can be quite useful. What in particular about this is a problem for you? So sometimes you can hear a client story and you can think, not quite sure what the problem is here. So ask them. Yeah. Again, if you're describing someone else in the situation, how would you describe them? Yeah. What do you think and feel about the situation? And then moving into goal setting. This is where you seek to move the client forward from being stuck by identifying an area in which progress can be made. So, it's quite different, isn't it? It's a person-centered therapy. It is more of a solution-focused model. It is a solution-focused model. And then finally, stage 3 action planning. And that is where you're asking the clients to self-assess, to put an action plan in place. So what are the possible ways forward in this situation is a good question. What of these feel best for you? So if they've got a few options, which of these feels best for you? What will you achieve if you do this? So you're thinking of what's called future pace. You're thinking of asking people not only about the decision that they may make, but also the consequences of that decision. And what will you do first and by when? So you're actually setting people a goal of I'll do this first, and then I'll do this and I'll do that. So this is why it is called a solution-focused model, because you're getting clients to action plan. So eventually you come to a review. So when clients came back for the next session, you would start off in this model after you've welcomed them and check they're okay. You'd go to a review. So you'd say, what have you done this week? What have you agreed to do? And what actions have you taken? So the idea is to turn good intentions into results. It's important to help the client set realistic, practical goals. The helper's role is to revisit the goals set by the client and review the progress made. Always follow up at the next meeting, which I've said. And remember, if a client hasn't met the goals, not to be judgmental. And maybe sometimes clients can have really big goals that may be unattainable. Maybe someone says, I want to go and get myself a girlfriend. Well, that's a goal, but in itself, it may be unattainable. You might need to kind of work out how you're going to meet people in a social setting or any setting where you may be able to form a relationship. So sometimes the end product, i.e. I want a girlfriend or a boyfriend, may not be achievable at the first instance. It might be about thinking about, well, how do I meet people would be probably a better goal. So where would I meet people? How am I going to get in contact with people would be a goal to set. So I'm going to show you again the model theory in graphic form, just to go over the structure and just to kind of recap really on what I've talked about today. So the exploration phase, that's very much about listening, using empathy, using attending skills, really listening to the client and trying to find their frame of reference. Challenging is about looking at any discrepancies in what they're telling you and trying to get them to see those discrepancies, or maybe kind of work through those discrepancies. And that could be a blind spots where someone doesn't actually realise how well they're doing. So those are discrepancies and challenging discrepancies. The action plan, which is how you're going to move forward, how the client decides they're going to move forward, what goals are they going to put in place. And then finally, the review, which would be at the next session, where you would be asking the clients how they've got on with their action plan, what's happened, have things changed, and if so, how. And if they haven't changed, then maybe thinking about different goals that they could set for themselves. Okay, we've had a look at the theory. Now let's have a look at the model. So here we are at the PowerPoint again, and we're going to look at the model of helping, and it's called SOLER, and it's a useful acronym to help us remind ourselves what skills and a way of being with the client are necessary for this model to be effective. So the first thing is sit squarely or at 45 degrees from the client. So in other words, you're sat facing the client. An open posture, so not being defensive, not having your arms crossed. So already we're seeing that this is about really being attentive and paying attention and giving the client your time and space for them to be heard. Lean towards the client if appropriate. When people lean towards us when they're listening, it really does show that we're paying attention and not just listening, but trying to hear the person, trying to hear their frame of reference and trying to understand them, but only if appropriate. Maintain eye contact. Now you notice I put a little star next to eye contact, and the reason for that is be thoughtful of other cultures. Some speakers, especially from the Asian subcontinent, may see eye contact as a sign of disrespect or over familiarity. So, well, in the West, we tend to see eye contact as something around honesty or being real and genuine. It's not the same for every culture, so be very thoughtful of that. And be relaxed. So that's SOLER. Squarely, open posture, lean towards the client, eye contact, and be relaxed. And I've just got a little picture here of SOLER in practice. You can see that the two people, they're connected. One person's leaning forward, really listening. The chairs are at 45 degrees. So that's what SOLER looks like in practice. Well, let's come to the end of the presentation. If you've liked what you've heard, then like us, share us, and subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.